Hello friends, and welcome back to this course titled as British Poetry. Friends, we have successfully completed the poetry of a very dynamic personality, William Wordsworth, in Unit 9, and the poem which we chose, Tinton Abbey, is one of the best poems of William Wordsworth. And there are various, let's say, things which are facts which are related to the poem, like how it was added in the section Lyrical Ballads as a last moment poem by William Wordsworth, and there are many other things about romanticism, etc., which we discussed in that unit while discussing the three different PPTs on William Wordsworth. Today, in this unit 10 which we are starting, we are going to begin talking about Wordsworth's contemporary, as all of you can guess, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And as all of you know, that he has written many famous works, out of which Kubla Khan is one. So, Kubla Khan is the poem which is prescribed in our syllabus, and we are now in today's class are starting Kubla Khan. But before moving to the content which we are going to discuss today, let me tell you the course outcome. In this 30 minutes lecture, you would be able to conceptualize willing suspension of disbelief in reference to Kubla Khan. So, what is the, let's say, concept of willing suspension of disbelief? How we can relate this particular concept, this critical concept, with the poem Kubla Khan, that is more important. You might read about willing suspension of disbelief on internet, the basic definitions, or how Coleridge has used it in his book Biographia Literaria. There are various things as a supporting material you can find on internet. But then, why today's lecture is important? We are going to relate this concept, willing suspension of disbelief, in reference to the poem Kubla Khan. So, with this note, let us start discussion on this topic, willing suspension of disbelief. The poem Kubla Khan seems a loosely structured composition. The first part being an opium-induced dream. Friends, all of us know we should not go into the personal life of Coleridge, but we know that at sometimes he uses opium. He used to consume opium. So, this is a kind of opium-induced dream. He was not in his, let's say, state of mind, his senses, and then this person, S.T. Coleridge, saw a daydream when he was under the strong intoxicating influence of opium. He wrote this poem Kubla Khan. So, just like the daydreams are very loosely structured, there is not very, let's say, tightly knit plot into that fictional work. In the same manner, this poem is also a little bit loosely structured composition. Just like in a realistic manner we see a daydream. The second part deals with his regret about forgetting the dream, like what we all experience after a dream. When we move forward into the poem, we see that in the second part of the poem, he deals with the regret about forgetting the dream. How, let's say, a person after wakes up from the sleep, a person forgets the dream. So, the experience of that dream when person is sharing in the form of poetry, that is something which made this poem Kubla Khan as a poem. And friends, when you read this poem, you will feel that like you share your dreams with anyone in your family or in your friend circle. In the same manner, S.T. Coleridge is sharing his dream into into the group of his readers. The poet lapses into an opium-induced dream while reading about Kubla Khan's Xanadu. Now, when let's say we look at this poem, we find that the poet lapses into an opium-induced dream. The poet involves himself into an induced dream, also under the influence of the opium. While the poet was reading about a warrior, a king, Kubla Khan, and the place where he used to live, the name of that place is Xanadu. So, Coleridge was reading about it in a book, then he got asleep, and then in sleep he visualized this poem, Kubla Khan. He composes the first 3 stanzas describing the dream, and in the last stanza he suddenly shifts gears to talk about a vision. He had either about a damsel with a dulcimer singing a melodious composition. Friends, when we begin the discussion of this poem, we see that the poet has composed this poem into the first 3 stanzas, and these stanzas are describing the dreams. In the last stanza, the poet suddenly shifts let's say the discussion and starts talking about a vision he had earlier about the damsel with a dulcimer. There is a lady who has a musical instrument and she is singing a melodious composition with that. You can imagine, and you must have seen it in the let's say old movies or the movies which are based on ancient Greek let's say setup, that there are ladies which used to sing with a musical instrument in their hands with the strings. The reader is free to piece together all this in an effort to make sense out of it, or is free to leave it at that. So, when let's say Coleridge publishes this poem, he has no intention that you must feel what Coleridge has felt. The Coleridge makes the reader free whether you visualize the dream in the same manner like Coleridge has visualized, or the readers are free to leave it at that. Maybe they can simply feel that this is not reality, so they must not let's say read this poem. Then he do not force readers to believe and think like he thought about that incident. Coleridge says, willing suspension of disbelief for the moment is what constitutes the poetic faith. Now, when we look at the let's say criticism of Coleridge, we find that the concept of willing suspension of disbelief, which Coleridge has mentioned in his book, that at that particular moment, the poetic faith which helps poet to constitute that dream, to constitute that let's say construction of Xanadu, to constitute the life of Kubla Khan, all these things were real for Coleridge. And on what basis these let's say illusionary things were real? They were based on the critical concept of willing suspension of disbelief. The term was coined by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1817 with the publication of his Biographia Literaria, or biographical sketches of my literary life and opinions. Friends, Coleridge wrote a very famous critical book. The name of the book is Biographia Literaria. The other name is Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions. The book was published in 1817, where he talked about the major critical concepts or the poetic theory which he is trying to create through his poems. And what he has to say, I quote now. In this idea originated the plan of the lyrical ballads, in which it was agreed that my endeavors should be directed to person and characters supernatural, or at least romantic. So, we can say that Coleridge has intentionally inclined his ideas towards something that is supernatural or at least romantic. So maybe Coleridge is intentionally trying to create a virtual world. It do not exist in reality, but he wished to, let's say, create the poetry related to that. Yet, so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitute poetic faith. So, poet S.T. Coleridge want to live in his own, let's say, inner self. He had no concern with the outer world, but he is more concerned about the inward nature of human interest. And the semblance of truth, let's say the image of truth, which he has created in his inner self, that is sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination. So, the imagination or the shadows of imagination which he has created in his inner self, although they are not real, but they are very real for Coleridge. This kind of willing suspension of disbelief, it means he is willing, Coleridge is willing, he want to, let's say, suspend the disbelief into these illusionary things. So, now I think the concept is clear to you. Willing, suspension of disbelief. You are willingly suspending the concept of disbelief on the ideas which are going in your inner self. It means whatever is going on in your inward nature, you are considering all of those things as true, and Coleridge is willingly doing it. He wants to live in the virtual world, he wants to live in his inner world, he wants to live in that poetic faith which is constituted into his poetry. So, he believes in that world, that is not illusionary for him. The abrupt switch in the poem occurs after a distraction takes place in the poet's thought about the dream trying to remember its context. When poet was asleep and he was, let's say, in the mid of that dream, the poet had some kind of distraction. There was a thought process of dream going on in its full flow, and poet tried to remember the content after he wake up, but not full, let's say, content was remembered by the poet. The distraction comes in the form of an hours' interruption by the visit of a certain Parlock. Who is Parlock? Now, there was a visitor, poet calls him a Parlock. So, a visitor, a person comes, he knocks at the door, and suddenly Coleridge wakes up. And this, let's say, after an hour's interruption which happened in his dream, this was the reason due to which poet was not able to complete that dream. A visitor who interrupts his efforts to remember the opium dream, bringing him back to the work-a-day world and robs him of the completeness of the dream. Friends, generally we had observed that the opium eaters live in the dream world. Most of the time they are half conscious, half unconscious, and they are habituate of visiting that kind of opium dream, that daydreaming, that work day world which is created in their mind, that is, let's say, that was robbed because of this Parlock, and the completeness of dream could not happen in the mind of Coleridge. He can't recognize the complete dream after waking up. Two extended metaphors work in the poem, loosely connected to each other. When we look at the structural analysis of the poem, we see that there are extended metaphors which are used by poet, total in 2. And these extended metaphors are connected to each other. The first metaphor is about a pleasure dome commanded to be built by Kubla Khan. So, what is the first metaphor? There is a pleasure dome. Dome means where, let's say, a kind of palace which Kubla Khan has commanded to build for himself. So, it is, let's say, under process. The metaphor is a self-contained piece of fiction, maintaining a semblance of a work-a-day world's logic, but it's loosely structured, created in the haze of an opium-induced dream. So, when we, let's say, look at the reality of this metaphor as you know is a kind of implied simile. So, this metaphor is a self-contained piece of fiction. A complete fiction can be written into this first metaphor, maintaining the semblance of the work-a-day world's logic. Maintaining the logic of the present world. What present world need to think about the palace building of Kublai Khan, that can be maintained on that virtual world. But it is loosely structured. So, when we look at this poem, we find, as I told you earlier also, that the poem is loosely structured, that is created in the haze of an opium-induced dream. Under the influence of the opium, this dream was, let's say, created in the mind of S.T. Coleridge. The pleasure dome has all the elements of mystery and exoticism. When we look at the pleasure dome which is being created for Kublai Khan, maybe by his workmen, we find all the elements of mystery and exoticism. There is exoticness, there is something which is related to the, let's say, Eastern mysteries, the West and the East. The Eastern mysteries were very much visible in the way this palace is created. It is, let's say, very mystical in its form. Let us now read a few lines from the poem to understand the mystery or the exoticism which Coleridge is trying to create through his lines. And I quote, "Elf, the sacred river runs through caverns, measureless to men, down to a sunless sea." Now, poet says that there is a sacred river, Elf, where the souls need to travel after the life. So that Elf river is flowing, and it is flowing through the caverns, measureless to men. There are measureless caverns, let's say the ways through which it is traveling. Nobody can measure the depth or the darkness of those places. And the Elf river is traveling through all of them, down to the sunless sea. And it is traveling down, maybe it is coming from mountains, a sunless sea towards a sea that is dark, there is no sun. Sunless sea, gardens bright with ceneus rills. And there are gardens all around that which are so bright like a ceneus rills, incense bearing tree. And then there are trees which are, let's say, trying to create the peaceful atmosphere, the very different kind of dreamy atmosphere into that place. Romantic chasm, savage place. It is considered as the idealism of romanticism, completely romantic place, completely, let's say, unique kind of place. And it is a savage place. Savage means nobody knows that place, very isolated. Women waiting for her demon lover, huge fountains, etc. And there we have women who are waiting for her demon lover. Maybe demon is, let's say, symbolized for Kublai Khan, and there are women who are waiting for the lovers, and there is a huge fountain which is nearby that sea, and etc. So basically you can understand that Coleridge is trying to create a completely virtual world which do not exist in the reality, but it is with the willing suspension of disbelief, Coleridge wished to believe on these concepts. We have to stretch our suspension of disbelief a little more when we come to the bit about how Kublai Khan starts hearing prophecies of war from ancient voices. So, we have to, let's say, stretch our suspension of disbelief. We have to believe on this scene also, and then we have to believe a little more when we came to understand that Kublai Khan is a character who has started hearing the prophecies of war. Maybe the enemy is going to, let's say, attack on this city which Kublai Khan is building for himself. So, there are ancient voices which are warning Kublai Khan for that war. Amid all this tumult, says the poet, almost with the tongue in cheek, the internal consistency of the dream need not be questioned. So, under the influence of this concept of willing suspension of disbelief, poet think that there is a, let's say, tongue in cheek. We have to believe on, let's say, these concepts. The internal consistency of dream that need not to be questioned into this situation. Dreams have no logic like what we have in real life, and it is our memory of a dream that imposes a logic framework linking the individual elements of the total meaning. So, S.T. Coleridge personally believed that when we see dreams, they have, although they do not have a logic like what we have in the real life, and we can consider dream as our memory of a dreamer, that imposes a logical framework linking the individual elements to the total meaning. So, there are fragments, their dreams are in pieces, and we have to link the dreams into the individual elements of the total meaning. A compiled meaning can be created when this, let's say, complete dream can be frameworked upon. Unfortunately, Parlock comes and interrupts the poet's recollection of the dream, and what is resumed after an hour is bound to be incoherent and out of piece with the earlier account of the dream. Now, when this Parlock comes and then he disturbs S.T. Coleridge for complete 1 hour, there was a discussion that went on between both of them. After that, Coleridge was able to remember only, let's say, a fragment of that dream, not the complete dream, and he was able to recollect some memories, and he was able to, let's say, create that account of dream, that earlier account of dream, into the shape of this poem, Kublai Khan. But in the last stanza, the poet makes a brave attempt to link the post-Parlock thoughts with the earlier recollection of the dream. So, when poet kept on writing this poem Kublai Khan, he was able to relate few things with the, let's say, with the reality what he had seen. He was able to recollect some, let's say, images of the dream. Hence, a damsel with a dulcimer rises up to the surface, and what had happened earlier in the dream is like to these thoughts. And then poet recognized that there was a damsel with a dulcimer, which he saw in the poem Kublai Khan, and she rises up to the surface. And then later what had happened, all those things were, let's say, remembered by the poet Coleridge. Her music is such as to enable a creation of a Xanadu, and if only he could hear her melody. So, when she was, let's say, playing the music, it was just like building a complete city, a complete Xanadu. Her music was so powerful that it can create a complete city, and the poet could only hear her melody, not the lyrics. The poet find it difficult to suspend his own disbelief, and the dream was so, let's say, powerful, the dream was so important for the poet that he wanted to write a poem on that. Then there are some memorable usages of this willing suspension of disbelief which we can see in this poem. Take for example, we have incense bearing tree, frankincense or myrrh referred to in the Bible. So, poet has quoted some biblical images, and in which he had, let's say, this image of incense bearing tree. Maybe he is talking about the tree of knowledge which is, let's say, referred to in the Bible. He had seen that kind of tree in the poem. Then we have another phrase as romantic chasm that slanted down the green hill. Romantic chasm sounds sarcastic in the sense of the chasm between lovers that increase their passion, but here romantic does not mean loverly distance, but something like what we mean by romantic poetry. So, Here when we talk about romantic chasm, it doesn't mean the chasm in the traditional sense where the lovers are, let's say, waiting for to meet each other. But here poet is trying to create an altogether romantic imagery through this poem. Then we have another line, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing. Earth is thick fast pants sound hip, but pants mean not trousers but only long measured breaths. So we can here assume that earth is breathing in the poem. So the let's say place was so beautiful that poet is trying to see the breathing of earth like a human being. Then we have another line from the poem, huge fragments vaulted like resounding hall, chaffy grain beneath the threshers is frail. So you might find the vocabulary typical, but poet is here trying to say that there are, let's say, huge fragments like resounding hall which are, let's say, coming from the fountains. Then we have chaffy grain beneath the threshers frail. We have, let's say, threshers frail, different kind of noises which are coming from the background. Then, for he on honeydew hath fed and drink the milk of paradise. And then he says that the river, the fountains, the water is just looking like a honeydew that is feeding from the, let's say, fountains, and the Kubla Khan is going to drink the milk of that paradise at that beautiful place. Indeed, the poet hath fed on honeydew and drunk the milk of paradise. Maybe we can assume that the poet S.T. Coleridge himself is present at that place and he wants to drink that milk of paradise. The second extended metaphor is a self-contained vision of damsel with her dulcimer, singing symphony and song. When we move on to the poem and we see the second extended metaphor, extended means discussed in detail in many lines. That is the concept of damsel with her dulcimer. I told you, a lady singing with a musical instrument, singing symphony and song in the poem. The only connection with the first metaphor of the Xanadu dream is the poet's wish to create a similar paradise in the air if only he could hear her song. So there are, let's say, two metaphors in the poem. The first metaphor is the setting of that place where Xanadu is going to be constructed. The second metaphor is about the poetic, let's say, poetic strength of the lady who is singing on a musical instrument, and that song was so powerful that a complete, let's say, a city can be created, a complete paradise can be created on that. And poet is trying to relate the first metaphor with the second metaphor in the poem. Both the extended metaphors have a running logic within them, the logic of a dream in the first metaphor and that of a vision in the second one. So we see a kind of logic in these two metaphors, because when we look at the first one, we see the first one with the logic of dream and the second one with the vision. So maybe poet is trying to say that music or rhythm is so much powerful that it can construct a complete palace on its own. But when we see the dreamer hath fed on honeydew and drunk the milk of paradise, our disbelief is easily suspended and poetic faith restored. But when we, let's say, look at this poem and the end of this poem, and we see that Coleridge, the dreamer, he has fed on the honeydew, he has consumed the honeydew and drink the milk of paradise, then our disbelief on, let's say, on thinking that these things do not exist, it easily suspended, and we started believing on poet's portrait, poet's imagery, believing that these things are real. When you read the poem, then you feel that you are with Coleridge in his dream, and then believing that all these things are true. So the way S.T. Coleridge has created this poem, that makes this poem completely, let's say, different in the tradition of writing poetry. So I think you have now understood the concept of willing suspension of disbelief and how poet is trying to use it into this poem, Kubla Khan. That is all for today. Thank you for listening.